So we looked at concerns that Margolis's response to examples like abstinence and contraception are inadequate to the concerns that his view equates engaging in abstinence or contraception with uh, committing premeditated murder. That is, each of them commits an equally heinous moral harm against an individual with flow by preventing them from actualizing their flow. And I suggested that Marquise's response here that there was no individual identifiable as the individual who our actions caused harm to didn't actually seem to show that there was no individual who was harmed by our actions in this way. And so it didn't seem adequate. And I think that this points to a sort of general difficulty with this position. In general, when you think about potentialities or possibilities, and you're trying to argue for courses of action on the basis of these potentialities, then you really have to be pretty confident in the potentiality, and you have to have a pretty principled way of differentiating when something is a real potentiality and when it isn't. And I think that this is a really, really difficult challenge for any view that's based on possibilities and potentialities here. And I think that Margolis doesn't really take that challenge seriously enough to make the view as credible as maybe you'd like it to be. So, to start with, the potentiality itself is kind of ill-defined from Marquis. And he's completely honest about that. He makes no pretenses that there's this determinate future like ours where we can specify exactly what counts as that future and what doesn't count as that future. But the nebulous nature of what it is to have the benefits of consciousness or a future like ours or a future that we value, these things need to be pretty determinate if they're the basis for deciding whether or not an entity has flow or doesn't have flow. And this kind of becomes clear when we look at the analogical extensions of the flow argument to the rights of animals. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, just how much rationality does an animal have to exhibit? And what kind of rationality does an animal have to exhibit for it to be sufficiently like ours to constitute flow? To what degree do they have to exhibit self-awareness, and so on? And none of these questions are actually answered in any reasonable or principled way. And that's troubling if we're basing our view about right to life on attributions of flow. In addition to just the ill-defined nature of the potentiality, there isn't any principled or reasoned way of deciding whether or not a particular entity has flow or doesn't have flow. At least in my assessment, it seems like a significant amount of work needs to be done for the theory to be viable at all. And so, for example, we noticed in the abortion brief that many forms of contraception, in fact, accomplish contraception by preventing eggs from implanting on the womb in the womb. And so they don't necessarily prevent fertilization. And so Marquise's response here to the abstinence and contraception objection is, well, there is no identifiable entity that suffers harm from our actions. But it looks like in cases of IUD, birth control pills, morning after pills, that there is in fact an identifiable entity that by his criterion has flow, a fertilized egg, and that our actions prevent that egg from actualizing that potential. They harm that egg by preventing it from having a future like ours. And so on this view, using birth control pills or having an IUD or taking a morning after pill is as morally heinous as premeditated murder. So abortion isn't the only thing that this view seems to equate with having the moral status of premeditated murder. Uh, Being on the birth control pill or having an IUD or taking the morning after pill, all of these seem to be on par with premeditated murder on this view. And there are also questions about the implications for things like miscarriages and stillbirths. So we noticed in the abortion briefing that about 24,000 stillbirths occur each year, where there's a pregnancy that proceeds at least to the 20th week, but the baby isn't viable, and as a result, the pregnancy isn't successful. Those are classified by the CDC as stillbirths. Pregnancies that don't go to delivery at any time prior to 20 weeks are considered to be miscarriages. And there are about 1 in 5 pregnancies that end in miscarriages according to the statistics. Now, in all of these cases, the question arises, should we be pursuing negligence on the part of the woman here? Is this view of flow suggesting to us that if they acted in a way that in any way contributed to the harm of a fetus not actualizing flow, then those are maybe cases of negligent homicide. Those are cases that we ought to be investigating on this view. And that doesn't seem to jibe with people's intuitions about these cases. People's intuitions about these cases is we don't have to investigate to determine whether or not the mother was negligent because a fetus was stillborn. We don't have to determine whether or not we should be charging them with a second-degree murder if they acted recklessly and as a result they lost their child, even if that wasn't their intent, and things of this nature, which do seem to be possible implications that aren't ruled out by any reasons or principles that Marquis articulates. And similarly, the theory seems to suggest that right to life has a corresponding right on the part of agent with flow to require that people sacrifice their rights to facilitate their actualization of flow. So, as Thompson notes, right, even if a fetus has a right to life, that doesn't straightforwardly, without further reasoning, suggest that the fetus, in fact, now has a right to demand use of the mother's body, even if the denial of that use would result in the fetus's death. And as she points out, we may think that this is morally praiseworthy or that people ought to do that when it's not too onerous a burden. But we don't in general require or think that it's morally necessary that individuals act as good Samaritans or superlative Samaritans in this way, and that we don't suggest that there's impositions of such requirements in cases outside of pregnancy. So we don't require that Bill Gates sacrifice his right to billions and billions of dollars because by doing so he facilitates the survival of entities with flow. But this seems to be a consequence of this view that Margolis doesn't address or rule out or even really comment on. And so it makes the view problematic in that way. And finally, there's a potential implication of this view that strikes me as morally troubling. So the view says that an entity has a right to life in virtue of having flow, and that the moral harm done to an entity by killing it results from depriving it of this future like ours. And so the suggestion here, and a suggestion that Marquis seems to endorse is that entities that don't have flow don't have a right to life and don't suffer moral harm when they're killed. Now, if this is really the case, it seems to introduce this sort of bizarre set of circumstances that seems, from a moral perspective, repulsive and unacceptable, but that seems to be condoned by his theory. So, any entity that definitely doesn't have a future like ours, and that definite lack of a future like ours isn't dependent upon the choices that we make, that seems to be a case where we've got no moral obligations towards that entity. It has no right to life, and our actions that would result in its death don't cause a moral harm to it, because it's not our actions that are going to result in it not having flow. It's the fact that it doesn't have flow, and hence we can't deprive it of a future like ours, since it won't, by definition, have a future like ours. So we can imagine cases like this, and we can imagine cases that look morally repulsive that are like this. So imagine that there's an individual who enjoys taking innocent lives. They enjoy killing entities that have done nothing to them. They enjoy it tremendously. Now, they're prohibited on this view, morally, from killing entities that have flow. But if an entity loses its flow, if it definitively doesn't have a future like ours, it doesn't have this potential good of consciousness in the future, then it has no right to life, and there is no moral harm inflicted on it by killing it. And so we can imagine, for instance, a case of a terminally diagnosed cancer patient who's about to die, and this person, in order to gain some enjoyment, kills that terminal cancer patient right before it's about to die. That cancer patient is going to die. It has no flow, or the person has no flow, not yet. That person has no flow on this notion, and hence has no right to life, and hence no moral harm is done to it by depriving it of flow. And so on this view, it seems morally acceptable to kill that terminal cancer patient right before they die for the purposes of, I don't know, pleasure and self-gratification. And that seems morally repulsive, not morally acceptable. That just seems wrong. And we could imagine extrapolations to other cases. So suppose we discover, right, that someone is going to kill a pregnant woman. Well, now we know that that pregnant woman definitively doesn't have flow, and that the fetus inside her doesn't have flow either. So now on this view, we no longer have any moral harm that we can cause her by depriving her of flow, because definitively she's going to die and she doesn't have flow. And the fetus is going to die, it doesn't have flow. And so killing the mother or the fetus now seems morally acceptable on this view. Killing it out of the motive of pleasure, that just seems morally despicable. But on this view, there's nothing morally wrong with it at all. It's not on par with murder or premeditated murder. It's morally acceptable. There is no harm caused to the fetus because it has no flow. So again, this seems like a consequence of the view that doesn't jibe with our pre-theoretic intuitions or our ordinary judgments about the moral status in cases like this. And so all of these cases raise problems for this view that need to be addressed if the view is to be considered viable.